Greetings, loyal viewers! Now, I know I said at the end of my Spyro 3 review that I was going to do my countdown for my favorite PS1 games of all time, and don't worry, we will get to that, but I wanted to, I was thinking to myself, why stop at reviewing with the original trilogy? Why not we go a little bit further, since we're still just barely in the month of September, aka Spyro's anniversary, this one in particular being his 20-year anniversary, but whatever. So I thought to myself, why not talk a bit more in depth than I did in my reviews about my favorites and some of my least favorite levels of the Spyro trilogy, starting with my least favorites. Now, before we get started, I'm going to lay down a few ground rules. Number one, I'm going to be sticking to traditional Spyro levels, not only because, well, it is Spyro, but I feel like sticking to his levels in particular, I feel like would make this list just a little bit more interesting. Secondly, because of that, I'm not going to be including things like flight and or boss levels. They're bosses and flight stages, so technically they don't follow under the traditional formula. Thirdly, and most importantly, and keep in mind this is my opinion on this list, yes, you may like some of these levels a lot, but me personally, they either just have the least amount of impact on me compared to others, or have certain aspects that really get to me even as an adult. With that said, everything else is totally fair game, and we're going to be starting off Gargantuas countdowns for the first time ever with my top 8 worst Spyro levels of all time. So, with that said, let us begin the countdown in 3, 2, 1. I was honestly kind of unsure of which to pick for the start of the video, but I ultimately went with Cloud Temples over Mystic Marsh from Spyro 2 purely because A, I found the missions to be more fun overall in comparison, and B, I also found the level of Mystic Marsh to be, well, more mystical, if that even makes sense. Don't get me wrong, as a whole, I still do enjoy playing Cloud Temples enough. It's still nice to look at, nice to listen to, the Warlock enemies are kinda cool, and the Troll mission honestly isn't too bad. So what is it that just barely kicks this level into the worst for me? I could tell you with one shriek. Yep, while this is certainly far from the worst mission in these games, don't get me wrong, it's still pretty boring. All you do is simply follow him for a good few minutes to his so-called secret hideout, while avoiding being seen from him at all costs, otherwise he'll... yeah, that. Overall, while I do enjoy playing Cloud Temples in of itself, I do think the one mission alone elevates it at just the start of the list. That being said, it's still Game of the Year award worthy compared to some of the other choices further down the list, such as... yeah, not surprising to see a level from Spyro 1 make it this early onto the list, is it? And that's because I feel like Spyro the Dragon, even though I still do enjoy it immensely, has easily some of the least impressive level design of the original trilogy, particularly with having levels that, even from an aesthetic standpoint, just feel like extended pieces of the hub world that they're in. Much like the last entry, I was kind of unsure of which was a perfect example of this factor, or at least one of few, but I ultimately went with Dry Canyon simply because, to me anyway, it kind of feels among the most forgettable levels in the trilogy. I was close to giving this honor to Stone Hill, but given that it's the first level of the game as well as the entire trilogy, I gave it a little bit of a leeway. Plus, I just thought it looked more visually pleasing in comparison as well as having nicer music in my opinion. Don't get me wrong, the level still looks okay and has some nice enough music and kinda neat enemies, and that's really about it. Honestly, there really isn't too much for me to talk about with this level. To me, it just doesn't really present itself with too much to offer to make it stand out. While the level, on a technical level, really isn't that bad, it just feels like one of those levels that whenever I play it, it just kinda goes through one ear and then out the other. Except for the classic line.
Thank you for releasing me!
God, that is awesome. Unfortunately though, while Dry Canyon is kinda forgettable, it is not the absolute worst example of a level that looks and feels similar to the hub world. That honor goes to... even though Dry Canyon is dull in some ways, it's certainly not quite as boring as Gnorc Cove. While I do like the industrial look of the whole thing, as the name of the level would suggest, everything from the enemies, to the layout, to even the friggin' song in this, in my opinion, being one of the most forgettable songs in the trilogy. So you might be thinking, what with how very boring it all is, of why I didn't put this into the top 5. Well, for as incredibly boring as this level is, Like most levels from Spyro 1, it is fairly easy and straightforward, as well as still having a creative aesthetic to it, and there really isn't anything in it that's that infuriating per se, so ultimately, like most levels from Spyro 1, it's mostly harmless. As opposed to my least favorite level in the first game, which we'll get to later. Till then, why don't we finally go ahead and start talking about the levels that do have aspects that infuriate me. Starting with... Of all the Spyro 2 levels, this is among one of my least favorites for one reason and one reason only, which we'll get to in a minute. Like some of the previous entries, the rest of the level I actually kinda like okay. The inhabitants are cute, the way you fight the Earthshapers in this are actually kinda funny and creative, the climax is also nice and inventive, and the song is probably one of my personal favorites in the original trilogy. Bearing in mind, I'm also judging some of these entries depending on how much certain aspects still infuriate me to this day. That's also why I'm surprisingly not putting Fractured Hills on the list for the record. So, what is it that exactly elevates this level into the top 5 then? Hunter. While Hunter I do usually enjoy fine as a whole, this minigame is easily the most obnoxious minigame in Spyro 2, to me anyway. Why is that, you may ask? The camera. The camera in this cave is so enclosed onto you that you barely have any clue ahead of time of where any crystal popcorn is going to appear, since you can't hardly see much where any crystal popcorn is, and therefore, unless you're just quick enough, you'll end up just missing it, or Hunter will nab it before you like the freaking douche he is. Making things even worse, this is one of those missions in the trilogy that you have to beat twice, with the second round, not too surprisingly, being even harder with the crystal popcorn popping up even faster and Hunter almost always having the friggin' advantage. Sadly though, this is not the only example on this list of a level where its good merits are watered down by something infuriating or incredibly boring. Case in point... I know I probably already said this a couple times early on in this countdown, but much like some of the other entries, I was kind of unsure about including this or Spooky Swamp somewhere in the top 5 on here, but I ultimately ended up choosing Enchanted Towers simply because, despite some of this level's merits, a lot of it is largely diluted by the time you play as Sergeant Bird in this level. At first, it seems kinda cool to play as him in the main Spyro level, especially since I'm probably one of the few people who actually enjoys playing Sergeant Bird, but playing as him in such a gigantic level, mixed in with how slow he can be at times and having to search every nook and cranny to 100% this level from, well, the Enchanted Towers themselves, is so slow and tedious that it's one of the few times that I almost felt my brain turn to mush while playing it. Almost. Like I mentioned earlier, though, about this level's merits, the level design is quite nice, the enemies, at least the main devils, are nice and inventive, and the other mini-games, including the skateboarding one and escorting a young wolf to his owner, are actually not that bad either. I'd say the only part that's kinda lazy is the fact that the level's main theme is just the Sergeant Bird theme, and even though I don't mind the theme itself, considering how long this level is, especially when you play as Sergeant Bird, it's also one of those few times where I kinda found myself getting annoyed of the theme the same as everyone else. But seriously guys, let's get to the big ones, such as... So remember what I said earlier about Gnorc Cove not being my least favorite level in Spyro 1? Well, that's because that distinction, hands down, to me anyway, goes to Misty Bog from Beastmakers. Where do I even begin? I guess I can start by safely saying that, of all the levels in the original trilogy, this is by far the ugliest in terms of color palette. Which I get that maybe that was sort of the idea, but even then, it is just so unappealing to look at. The other notable reasons why, however, are these friggin' attack frogs.
And this used to be such a nice swamp.
Yeah, I'm sure it was. These enemies, while they don't seem that annoying in principle, in execution, their attacks with their tongues, mixed in with the fact that there's only 2, maybe 3 health replenishing chickens in this level, mixed in with this awful, awful room full of them, mixed in with armored Gnorcs that you have to charge to kill, which as a result can put you at a greater risk of being hit by the frogs, you've got a recipe for utter annoyance. The only 2 saving graces for this level are A, the music, And B, the way the level is structured really isn't that bad in most places. Aside, again, from that horrible room, there's quite a few fun moments of testing your gliding, alternate paths and such. Really, had the level just been given a better color palette and these attack frogs weren't so friggin' irritating, then this would only just barely, if even at all, be on the list. I'm not even kidding. And speaking of not kidding... Yeah, don't act like you didn't see this one coming. Much like Magma Cone, the rest of the level I actually think is alright. I especially like the gimmick of having ice breath in this world rather than the usual fire breath, which you can use to freeze enemies and even make for reaching certain places for treasure. And heck, I even think the cat hockey minigame isn't that bad. So, what is it that elevates this level so high in the... Oh, who am I kidding? You all know it's the friggin' boxing minigame. I've already went in great lengths to talk about how awful this minigame is in my review of the third game, so I won't prattle on too long about it. Just know that what everyone, me and my brother included, says about this minigame is pretty much true. The hitbox sucks, the range you and the enemy has is beyond inconsistent. Much like the Crystal Popcorn mission in Magma Cone, you have to beat it twice, with the second run being, not surprisingly, even harder than the last, purely not only because the fact that the enemy takes more hits to kill, but he's more aggressive and I've said this before and I'll say it again, screw this mission. Now I know what you're thinking. What could possibly be worse than the one with the absolute worst minigame of them all? Well, before we get to number one, let's go ahead and run through some dishonorable mentions. Stonehill. As far as levels go, it's the least interesting, definitely, but still harmless enough, and definitely calming that I left it off the list anyway. Fractured Hills. The Alchemist mission and Hunter missions are bad, don't get me wrong, but compared to some of the other ones that I mentioned on this list, they're honestly the least infuriating. Spooky Swamp. While I do think the Firefly Escort mission is more annoying than the Alchemist mission in my honest opinion, the rest of the level I absolutely like, especially the haiku speak. Yes, I just said that. Okay, so with those out of the way, let us go on to number one. And the number one worst Spyro level, in my opinion, is Super Bonus Round. I want to further explain than I did in my Spyro 3 review as to why I think this one is the worst, in my opinion. Don't get me wrong, it's not the ugliest, it's not the most boring, it's not even the worst put together of all the levels. But of all the ways in which you could end the original trilogy on, this one I found to be rather disappointing. So let's talk about it. To start off with, the name alone just sounds rather redundant. I mean, really, game? You couldn't come up with a better name than that? And even the characters in this don't really seem to treat it as big of a deal as they probably should, even with the true final boss in this. Which, then again, given how pathetically easy, like almost Spyro 1 levels of easy it is, I guess I can't really blame them too much on that front now, can I? Top it off with the second worst minigame involving a skateboarding race with the Yetis, where you have to be darn near perfect in order to even win, and a rather mediocre final cutscene, and I hope some of you can understand why Super Bonus Round is, in my opinion, the worst level in the Spyro trilogy. So that was my countdown, and I want to emphasize that, as much as I do dislike some of these levels, they're thankfully of a rare minority in an otherwise overall great trilogy. And if you want to see me spread just that little inkling of love left before the month of September is over, join me tomorrow as we talk about my top 8 favorite Spyro levels of all time. And until then, I'm King Gargantuas, and I'll see you all next time. Hey guys, thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe to me if you want to see more videos like this. Follow me on Twitter at King Gargantuas if you want to know what I'm up to. And if you want to support videos like this plus the many other ideas that I have in the near future, be sure to support me on patreon.com/KingGargantuas. Thanks again guys, and I'll see you all next time.